Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story is of Viktor Frankl, a seeker of shadows who dared to map the hidden continents of the mind. Relax as we explore the life and work of Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived the unspeakable darkness of the concentration camps and emerged with a profound understanding of human resilience, who explored the mind, discovering that even in the depths of suffering, meaning can be found, and that the will to meaning is the fundamental force that drives the human spirit forward through any circumstance. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychology and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the landscape of the soul. Tell me in the comments what draws you most: the mystery of dreams, the spark of emotion, the intangibility of spirit, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the life and work of Viktor Frankl as we wander the corridors of the unconscious and listen to the whispering mind beneath the mind. In the spring of 1905, in the great and ancient city of Vienna, a child was born into a world that stood on the threshold of immense transformation. The Austro-Hungarian Empire still held its fading grandeur. The coffee houses still buzzed with intellectual ferment, and the streets still echoed with the music of Strauss and the whispers of revolution. Into this world, on March 26th, came Viktor Emil Frankl, second of 3 children born to Gabriel Frankl and Elsa Lyon Frankl, a Jewish family of modest means but considerable aspirations. Gabriel Frankl worked as a civil servant in the Ministry of Social Service, a man of steady temperament and quiet dignity. He carried within him the values of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, which emphasized reason, education, and integration into European society while maintaining Jewish identity. Elsa, Viktor's mother, came from a family of Prague Jews, and she brought to their household a warmth and a certain spiritual depth that would later echo through her son's work. The Frankl home was neither wealthy nor impoverished, but it was rich in conversation, in books, and in the belief that education was the doorway to a meaningful life. Young Viktor grew up in Vienna's Leopoldstadt district, a neighborhood with a significant Jewish population where synagogues stood beside churches, and the complex tapestry of Central European identity was woven thread by thread. From his earliest years, there was something in Viktor that marked him as different, not in a way that separated him from others, but in a way that drew him deeper into questions that most children do not ask. He was a contemplative child, given to long periods of thought, and even as a boy, he was troubled by the great questions of existence. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but psychologically true in the way such stories often are, that when Viktor was still quite young, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, he suddenly became aware of the inevitability of his own death. This awareness did not come to him gradually, as it comes to most children, but struck him all at once with terrible clarity. He lay in his small bed one night and realized that someday he would cease to be, that his consciousness would end, that he would die. The terror of this realization gripped him, but rather than turning away from it, rather than seeking comfort and distraction, the young Viktor turned toward the question. He began to wonder, even then, what meaning life could have if it was destined to end. This early confrontation with mortality would become the foundation of everything he would later develop. As Viktor grew older, his intellectual gifts became apparent. He attended the real gymnasium, the scientific secondary school, where he excelled particularly in biology and psychology. But it was not merely academic success that characterized his adolescence. It was a hunger, a deep and abiding hunger to understand the purpose of human existence. While other boys his age were discovering sports and romance, Viktor was reading Freud and Schopenhauer, wrestling with ideas that would have taxed minds twice his age. In the Vienna of Viktor's youth, psychology was in its infancy, but burning with revolutionary energy. Sigmund Freud had already published The Interpretation of Dreams, and psychoanalysis was spreading through the intellectual circles of Europe like wildfire. The human mind, which had been the domain of philosophy and religion for millennia, was now being examined with the tools of science. The unconscious was being mapped. The hidden motivations of behavior were being brought to light, and the city of Vienna was the epicenter of this transformation. Viktor was drawn to these ideas with an intensity that bordered on obsession. While still in gymnasium, at the age of 15 or 16, he began corresponding with Sigmund Freud himself. Imagine the audacity of this, a teenager writing letters to the most famous psychiatrist in the world, discussing his own ideas about psychology and philosophy. But Freud, to his credit, recognized something in the young man's letters. They corresponded, and Freud even arranged for one of Viktor's early papers to be published in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis when Viktor was still a student. The paper discussed the process of affirmation in psychoanalysis, and though it was a minor work, it represented the beginning of Viktor's engagement with the psychological establishment. Yet even as Viktor immersed himself in Freudian theory, even as he was being welcomed into the psychoanalytic circle, something in him resisted. Freud's vision of human nature, powerful and revolutionary as it was, seemed to Viktor to be incomplete. Freud saw human beings as driven primarily by the pleasure principle, by the satisfaction of instinctual drives, particularly sexual drives. The unconscious, in Freud's model, was a cauldron of repressed desires and unresolved conflicts from childhood. Therapy consisted of bringing these hidden forces into consciousness, of making the unconscious conscious, so that the individual could gain mastery over their inner life. This was brilliant, and Viktor recognized its brilliance. But it was not enough. It did not account for what Viktor had observed in himself and in others. It did not account for the human capacity for self-transcendence, for sacrifice, for choosing meaning over pleasure. It did not explain why a person might voluntarily endure suffering for the sake of a cause they believed in, or why someone might find profound fulfillment in caring for another person, even when it brought them no pleasure at all. Viktor's dissatisfaction with Freudian psychoanalysis led him to explore other approaches. He became interested in the work of Alfred Adler, who had broken away from Freud to develop his own school of individual psychology. Adler emphasized the will to power, the striving for superiority, as the fundamental human drive. Where Freud saw human beings as pushed from behind by instinctual forces, Adler saw them as pulled forward by goals and aspirations. This resonated more with Viktor, and for several years during his late teens and early 20s, Viktor was actively involved with Adler's circle. He attended meetings of the Society for Individual Psychology, contributed papers, and engaged in the lively debates that characterized the Vienna psychological scene. But again, Viktor found himself unsatisfied. Adler's emphasis on the will to power, on the striving for superiority and significance, captured something important about human motivation, but it still missed what Viktor considered to be the essential element. It was still too focused on the self, on what the individual could achieve or become. It did not account for the human capacity to find meaning in something beyond the self, to discover purpose in serving something greater than one's own advancement. There came a point, in his early 20s, when Viktor parted ways with Adler as well. It was not an acrimonious split, but it was definitive. Viktor realized that he needed to forge his own path, to develop his own understanding of human nature that went beyond both Freud's will to pleasure and Adler's will to power. He began to formulate the idea that would become the cornerstone of his entire life's work: the will to meaning. Human beings, Viktor came to believe, are fundamentally driven not by the pursuit of pleasure or power, but by the search for meaning. This was the primary motivation of human life, the deepest hunger of the human soul. Viktor entered the University of Vienna to study medicine, specializing in neurology and psychiatry. These were the years of his formal education, but his real education was happening everywhere, in the coffee houses where intellectuals debated, in the clinics where he began to work with patients, in the quiet moments of reflection when he turned his analytic gaze inward. He completed his medical degree in 1940 at the age of 25 and immediately began working in the field that would define his early career: suicide prevention. Vienna, in the early 1930s, was a city of shadows. The economic depression had spread across Europe, leaving unemployment and desperation in its wake. Among young people, particularly students, there was an epidemic of suicide. Viktor became obsessed with understanding and preventing this tragedy. He established youth counseling centers throughout the city, offering free psychological support to young people in crisis. The approach was innovative for its time, recognizing that many suicides were not the result of mental illness in the traditional sense, but of existential despair, of a loss of meaning and purpose. The success of these centers was remarkable. In 1 year, through Viktor's efforts, not a single student in Vienna committed suicide, a stark contrast to previous years when dozens had taken their own lives. This work confirmed for Viktor what he had already begun to suspect, that the greatest psychological ailment of modern life was not neurosis in the classical sense, but what he would come to call the existential vacuum, a feeling of emptiness and meaninglessness that afflicted people who had lost connection to any purpose beyond their immediate desires and comforts. Throughout the 1930s, as Viktor established himself as a practicing psychiatrist, the political situation in Europe was deteriorating. The rise of fascism, the spread of anti-Semitic policies, the gathering storm clouds of what would become the Second World War, all of this was happening around him. Yet Viktor continued his work, continued to develop his ideas, even as the ground was shifting beneath his feet. In 1937, Viktor opened his own practice, specializing in the treatment of depression and suicide prevention. He worked at the Rothschild Hospital, one of the few places where Jewish doctors could still practice as the Nazi influence spread. He was becoming known in Viennese medical circles for his innovative approaches, for his emphasis on the patient's search for meaning rather than simply the alleviation of symptoms. He published papers, gave lectures, and was slowly building the framework of what would become logotherapy, though he had not yet given it that name. Then came the Anschluss in 1938, when Nazi Germany annexed Austria, and everything changed. The persecution of Jews, which had been gradual and insidious, became open and brutal. Jewish businesses were confiscated. Jewish professionals were barred from their occupations, and the Jewish community of Vienna, which had been one of the most vibrant and accomplished in Europe, was suddenly reduced to a terrorized minority struggling for survival. Viktor was offered a visa to the United States in 1941. It was a chance to escape, to save himself from what was clearly coming. He struggled with this decision with an intensity that revealed everything about his character. On the one hand, there was the rational voice urging him to leave, to preserve his life so that he could continue his work. On the other hand, there was his sense of responsibility to his parents, who were too old to emigrate and who would be left behind if he left. He wrestled with this decision for weeks, torn between survival and duty. The story goes that one day, walking through his parents' apartment, he noticed a piece of marble on the table, a fragment his father had retrieved from the ruins of a synagogue that had been destroyed by the Nazis. Viktor asked his father what it was, and his father explained that it was a piece of stone bearing one of the commandments, specifically the commandment to honor thy father and thy mother. Viktor took this as a sign, as the answer to his dilemma. He let the visa expire and stayed in Vienna with his parents. In December 1941, 9 months after letting the visa expire, Viktor married Tilly Grosser, a young woman who worked as a nurse and who shared his deep sense of purpose. They married, knowing what likely awaited them, married despite the darkness gathering on all sides, married because they believed in the meaningfulness of human connection even in the face of catastrophe. It was an act of profound existential courage, an affirmation of life in the midst of death. Within a year, the deportations began. In 1942, Viktor, his wife Tilly, his parents, and his brother were all deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp, the first stop on a journey into hell. Theresienstadt was used by the Nazis as a showcase camp, a place they could show to international observers to claim they were treating Jews humanely. But it was still a place of suffering, deprivation, and death. Viktor's father died there within months of their arrival, succumbing to starvation and exhaustion. From Theresienstadt, Viktor was transported to Auschwitz in October 1944, on what he would later recall as one of the last transports. The journey itself was a descent into nightmare. Cattle cars packed with human beings, no food, no water, people dying and collapsing against each other. When the train doors opened at Auschwitz, Viktor and the others stumbled out into the glaring lights and the shouting guards. This was the moment of selection, when prisoners were divided into those who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers and those who would be kept alive for forced labor. Viktor went to the left, the side of those selected for labor. He did not know it at the time, but his mother and wife were sent to the right, to immediate death, in a single moment. Without even the chance to say goodbye, his entire family was taken from him. He would learn of their deaths only later, and the knowledge would be a wound that never fully healed. The experience of the concentration camps defies simple description. How does one speak of a place designed to strip human beings of their humanity, to reduce them to numbers, to extinguish not just their lives but their very sense of self? Viktor spent time in several camps: Auschwitz, Kaufering, and Turkheim, all subcamps of Dachau. He worked in brutal conditions, digging and laying tracks for railway lines in the freezing cold, his body wasting away from starvation, disease constantly threatening, the ever-present possibility of being selected for death. Yet it was in this extreme situation, in this place of absolute suffering, that Viktor's ideas about meaning were tested and ultimately confirmed. He observed himself and his fellow prisoners with the eye of a trained psychiatrist, even as he endured the same horrors they did. He noticed that survival was not simply a matter of physical health or youth or strength. Some prisoners who seemed robust gave up and died quickly, while others, seemingly frail, found the will to continue. The difference, Viktor came to understand, was not in their circumstances, but in their attitude toward their circumstances, in whether or not they could find meaning even in suffering. There was a moment, which Viktor would later recount, when he was marching through the darkness on an icy morning, his feet wrapped in rags, his body racked with pain from beatings and hunger. The guard beside him was shouting and hitting the prisoners who stumbled. Viktor felt himself reaching the limit of endurance, felt the temptation to simply let go, to fall and let death come. But in that moment, his mind turned to his wife. He did not know she was already dead. He pictured her face with absolute clarity, and he spoke to her in his mind, poured out his love to her. In that communion, even with the image of someone he would never see again, he found meaning. He found a reason to take the next step, and the next. Another time, he was lying on the bare wooden planks that served as bunks, sick with typhus, fever burning through him. A fellow prisoner, a man he barely knew, came to him and asked for help. The man was in despair, ready to give up. Viktor, sick as he was, spent hours talking with him, helping him to find reasons to continue, helping him to see that even here, even in this place, life still expected something of him. In helping this stranger, Viktor found his own reason to live. The act of giving meaning to another person's suffering gave meaning to his own. Viktor also observed the different ways prisoners responded to their situation. Some became bitter and cruel, letting the brutality of the camps infect their own souls. Others maintained their humanity, sharing their last piece of bread, offering comfort, refusing to let the Nazis rob them of their inner freedom. Viktor realized that even in the concentration camp, perhaps especially in the concentration camp, human beings still possessed one fundamental freedom: the freedom to choose one's attitude. The Nazis could control every aspect of external life, could take away food, clothing, family, health, even life itself, but they could not control what went on in the inner life of the prisoner unless the prisoner surrendered that last freedom. This insight became the foundation of Viktor's later work. No matter what life takes from us, no matter what suffering we endure, we still retain the freedom to choose how we respond. This is not a naive optimism that denies the reality of suffering. Viktor was not saying that suffering doesn't matter, or that we should simply accept injustice. He was saying something more subtle and more profound, that even in suffering, we have the power to choose meaning, and in that choice lies our humanity. Viktor kept notes on scraps of paper throughout his time in the camps, hiding them in his clothes, recording his observations and his developing ideas. He lost these notes multiple times as he was moved from camp to camp, each time having his few possessions confiscated. But the ideas remained in his mind, burned into his consciousness by the extremity of his experience. In April 1945, as Allied forces approached, Viktor's camp was liberated by American troops. He emerged weighing less than 90 pounds, his body ravaged by disease and starvation, but his mind clearer than ever about what he had learned. He was 39 years old, and he had survived what most did not survive. But survival came with the devastating knowledge that his entire family was gone. His mother, his father, his brother, and his beloved wife Tilly had all perished. He was alone in the world. The months after liberation were in some ways as difficult as the camps themselves. Viktor returned to Vienna to find that the city he had known was gone. The Jewish community had been decimated. His home had been looted. His manuscript, the book he had been working on before deportation, was lost. He was surrounded by ghosts, by the memories of everyone he had lost. The weight of survival guilt pressed down on him, the question of why he had lived when so many others had died. In his grief and desperation, Viktor did something remarkable. He began to write. In 9 days, working in a fevered state of inspiration and anguish, he wrote the book that would later be published in English as Man's Search for Meaning. The original German title was Ein Psycholog erlebt das Konzentrationslager, which translates to A Psychologist Experiences the Concentration Camp. Later editions were titled Trotzdem Ja zum Leben sagen, which means saying yes to life in spite of everything. The book was Viktor's testimony, his attempt to make sense of what he had experienced, to find meaning in the suffering, to extract from the ashes of the Holocaust some wisdom that might help others. The first part of the book was a straightforward account of life in the camps, told with clinical precision but also with deep humanity. Viktor did not dwell on the horrors for their own sake. He was not writing a horror story. He was describing the psychological and spiritual reality of extreme suffering, showing how different people responded, what kept people alive, and what caused them to give up. The second part of the book was an exposition of his theory of logotherapy, the therapeutic approach he had been developing before the camps and which had been confirmed and deepened by his experience there. Man's Search for Meaning was published in 1946 in German and became an immediate success. It struck a chord with people in post-war Europe who were all, in one way or another, struggling with questions of meaning in the aftermath of catastrophe. How do you go on living when so much has been destroyed? How do you find purpose in a world that has revealed itself capable of such evil? Viktor's answer was not a philosophical abstraction, but a lived testimony. Meaning can be found even in suffering, and the search for meaning is what gives life its value. In the years immediately following the war, Viktor rebuilt his life with the same determination he had shown in the camps. He returned to his medical practice, resumed his work at the Polyclinic Hospital in Vienna, and began lecturing and writing prolifically. In 1947, he married Eleonore Schwind, a woman who would be his companion for the rest of his life. Together, they had a daughter, Gabrielle, and Viktor found in this new family a source of joy and meaning that helped heal the wounds of his losses. He also threw himself into the development and teaching of logotherapy. The term itself comes from the Greek word logos, which means meaning, and therapy, which means healing. Logotherapy, then, is healing through meaning. Viktor began training other therapists in his approach, establishing a network of practitioners who would carry his ideas forward. He lectured throughout Europe and eventually in the United States, where his work found an enthusiastic audience. In 1949, Viktor received his Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Vienna, his dissertation focusing on the relationship between psychotherapy and philosophy, particularly existential philosophy. This was important because it positioned logotherapy not just as a clinical technique, but as a comprehensive worldview, a philosophy of human nature that had practical therapeutic applications. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Viktor's international reputation grew. Man's Search for Meaning was translated into English in 1959, and it became a bestseller in the United States. American readers, living in the prosperity and comfort of the post-war boom, found themselves strangely moved by this book about concentration camps and the search for meaning. Perhaps they recognized in Viktor's work an answer to their own quiet desperation, the existential vacuum that afflicted even those whose material needs were abundantly met. Viktor was invited to teach in the United States, and he became a visiting professor at Harvard, Southern Methodist University, and other institutions. He traveled constantly, giving hundreds of lectures around the world, always returning to Vienna, where he continued his clinical practice and his teaching. He was a small man with an intense gaze and a self-deprecating sense of humor. Despite everything he had endured, or perhaps because of it, he had a profound appreciation for the small joys of life and a deep compassion for human suffering. In his later years, Viktor continued to write, producing more than 30 books, elaborating on the principles of logotherapy and applying them to various aspects of human life. He remained active well into his 90s, still seeing patients, still lecturing, still refining his ideas. He received numerous honors and awards, including honorary doctorates from 29 universities around the world. But he never sought fame for its own sake. He saw his work as a mission, a responsibility to share what he had learned so that others might benefit. Viktor Frankl died in 1997 at the age of 92 in Vienna, the city of his birth. He had lived long enough to see his ideas spread around the world, to know that his suffering had not been meaningless, that something of value had emerged from the darkness. Man's Search for Meaning has since sold more than 12 million copies and been translated into dozens of languages. It is consistently listed among the most influential books of all time. But numbers and accolades don't capture what Viktor's life really meant. What matters is that he took the worst that human beings can do to each other and transformed it into something life-affirming. He descended into hell and came back with a message that life has meaning under all circumstances, that we have the freedom to find that meaning, and that this search for meaning is what makes us human. Now let us turn from the story of the man to the substance of his ideas, from biography to psychology, from the life lived to the wisdom extracted from that life. Let us explore logotherapy, this healing through meaning, with the depth and care it deserves. At the heart of Viktor Frankl's psychology is a simple but profound assertion. Human beings are not primarily motivated by the pursuit of pleasure or the will to power, but by what he called the will to meaning. This is not just another theory to add to the collection of psychological theories. It is a fundamental reorientation of how we understand human nature. Sigmund Freud, the grandfather of modern psychology, had claimed that human beings are fundamentally driven by the pleasure principle, by the desire to satisfy instinctual drives and avoid pain. Alfred Adler, Freud's rebellious student, had countered that humans are primarily motivated by the will to power, by the striving for superiority and significance. Viktor Frankl, who had studied under both traditions and found them both inadequate, proposed something different, that human beings are most deeply motivated by the need to find meaning in their lives. This might seem like a small distinction, but it changes everything. If we are driven primarily by pleasure, then the goal of life is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, And psychological health means achieving a state of satisfaction and comfort. If we are driven primarily by power, then the goal is to achieve mastery, success, and recognition. And psychological health means becoming strong and significant. But if we are driven by meaning, then the goal is to discover and fulfill the unique purpose that our life calls us toward, and psychological health means living in alignment with that purpose, even when it requires sacrifice, even when it brings no pleasure or power. Viktor argued that the will to meaning is not just one motivation among many, but the primary motivation, the deepest human need. When this need is frustrated, when people cannot find meaning in their lives, they fall into what he called the existential vacuum, a state of emptiness and boredom that is the root of much modern psychological suffering. This existential vacuum manifests as depression, addiction, aggression, and despair. It is the feeling that life is pointless, that nothing really matters, that we are just going through the motions without purpose. The existential vacuum, Frankl believed, was becoming epidemic in modern society. As traditional sources of meaning like religion, community, and clear social roles had broken down, people were left without guidance about what their lives should be about. Material prosperity did not fill this vacuum. In fact, it often made it worse, because when people have all their physical needs met and still feel empty, they cannot even explain their suffering in terms of external deprivation. This is why Viktor's work found such resonance in affluent post-war America. People who had everything, by conventional standards, still felt that something essential was missing. Logotherapy is Viktor's response to this existential vacuum. It is a form of psychotherapy that helps people discover meaning in their lives. But how does one do this? How does a therapist help a patient find meaning? This is where Viktor's approach becomes subtle and sophisticated, because he understood that meaning cannot be given or prescribed. Each person must discover their own unique meaning. The role of the therapist is not to tell the patient what their life should mean, but to help them become aware of the meanings that are already there, waiting to be discovered. Viktor identified 3 primary ways that human beings can find meaning: through creating a work or doing a deed, through experiencing something or encountering someone, and through the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. These are not 3 separate categories, but 3 avenues through which meaning reveals itself. The first way, finding meaning through work or creation, is perhaps the most obvious. When we create something of value, when we contribute something to the world that goes beyond ourselves, we experience meaning. This could be through one's profession, through art, through building something, through raising children, through any activity that produces something of value. Viktor emphasized that it is not the nature of the work that matters so much as the attitude with which we approach it. Even seemingly mundane work can be meaningful if we understand how it contributes to something larger than ourselves. The second way to find meaning is through experience and love. When we fully experience beauty, whether in nature, art, or another person, we touch meaning. And most profoundly, when we love another person, when we recognize and cherish the unique and irreplaceable essence of that person, we discover a dimension of meaning that transcends our own existence. Love, for Viktor, is not primarily an emotion or a feeling, though feelings are involved. Love is the act of recognizing the full reality of another person, of seeing them in their uniqueness and potential, and of affirming their existence. This is why he could find meaning in his love for his wife even in the concentration camp, even after she was dead. The love was real, and it pointed beyond his own suffering to something eternal. The third way to find meaning, and perhaps the most challenging and most profound, is through the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. This is where Viktor's experience in the concentration camps gave him unique insight. When we are faced with a situation we cannot change, when suffering is unavoidable, we still have the freedom to choose our attitude toward that suffering. We can become bitter, or we can grow. We can let suffering destroy us, or we can let it transform us. We can see it as meaningless, or we can see it as an opportunity to transcend ourselves. Viktor was careful to emphasize that this does not mean we should seek out suffering or romanticize it. Suffering is not good in itself, and wherever suffering can be alleviated, it should be. But when suffering cannot be avoided, when we are faced with illness, loss, death, or any of the countless ways that life brings pain, then our response to that suffering becomes profoundly meaningful. In choosing to bear suffering with courage and dignity, in finding ways to grow through it rather than being destroyed by it, we transform something apparently meaningless into something deeply meaningful. This idea is easily misunderstood, so let us linger with it for a moment. Viktor was not saying that suffering is good, or that we should be grateful for terrible things that happen to us. He was not offering a theodicy, a justification for why bad things happen. He was making a much more practical and psychological observation that when we are suffering, our mental health and our ability to continue living with purpose depends on our ability to find meaning in the situation we find ourselves in. A person who sees their suffering as absolutely meaningless will despair. A person who can find some meaning in it, even if only the meaning that comes from bearing it courageously, can endure. Viktor gave many examples from his time in the camps. He spoke of prisoners who, having lost everything, still found ways to comfort others, to share their last piece of bread, to maintain their inner dignity. These acts did not change their external circumstances, but they transformed the meaning of those circumstances. He also spoke of prisoners who kept themselves going by thinking of what they would do when the war was over, the work they would complete, the people they would find again. This future-oriented meaning gave them a reason to survive. One of Viktor's most famous therapeutic techniques is based on this idea of finding meaning through attitude. It is called paradoxical intention, and it works by helping patients step outside of their anxious self-focus through humor and reframing. The technique is particularly effective for anxiety disorders and obsessive thinking. The logic of paradoxical intention is this: when we are anxious about something, we typically try to fight against the anxiety, to make it go away. But this very fight often increases the anxiety, creating a vicious cycle. The person who is afraid of blushing tries desperately not to blush, and this very effort makes them more self-conscious and more likely to blush. The person who is afraid of not being able to sleep tries desperately to fall asleep, and this effort keeps them awake. The person who is anxious about having a panic attack monitors themselves constantly for signs of panic, and this monitoring itself triggers panic. Paradoxical intention reverses this dynamic by having the patient deliberately intend, with humor and exaggeration, the very thing they fear. The person afraid of blushing is instructed to try to blush as much as possible to set a record for blushing. The person afraid of not sleeping is told to stay awake as long as possible. The person afraid of panic is instructed to try to have the biggest panic attack they've ever had. What happens, almost invariably, is that the symptom disappears or becomes much less intense. Why? because the person has stepped outside the self-defeating cycle of anxiety about anxiety. They have changed their attitude toward their symptom, and in doing so, they have broken its power over them. Viktor tells the story of a bookkeeper who came to him with a severe writing phobia. Whenever the man had to write in front of others, his hand would shake uncontrollably, making his writing illegible. This had become so severe that he was in danger of losing his job. The fear of shaking caused him to shake, which increased his fear, which caused more shaking. Viktor instructed the man to go to work and deliberately try to show everyone what a good shaker he was, to show them that he could shake so hard the whole desk would move. The man, with some skepticism but desperate enough to try anything, followed this instruction. He tried to shake and found that he couldn't. The symptom disappeared because he had changed his relationship to it. He had stepped outside the vicious cycle through humor and intentional reversal. This technique might sound simple, even silly, but it represents a profound psychological truth. We have more power over our experience than we realize. Not power to control what happens to us, but power to change our relationship to what happens to us. This is a form of freedom that exists even in the most constrained circumstances. Another key technique in logotherapy is de-reflection. This addresses a different but related problem, the problem of hyperreflection, or excessive self-monitoring and self-focus. Many psychological problems are exacerbated by the patient's constant focus on themselves, their symptoms, their performance, their state of mind. The person with insomnia lies in bed, monitoring whether they're falling asleep. The man worried about sexual performance becomes so focused on his performance that spontaneity becomes impossible. The person with social anxiety is so focused on how they're coming across that they cannot actually engage with other people. De-reflection means turning attention away from oneself and towards something or someone else. It is based on Viktor's concept of self-transcendence, the idea that human beings are fundamentally oriented toward things beyond themselves. We are most truly human when we are directed toward meanings to fulfill and people to love, not when we are obsessed with our own psychological states. Viktor would often encourage patients to find something outside themselves to focus on, a project, a cause, another person. He would help them see that their obsessive self-focus was actually the problem, not the solution. By redirecting attention outward, toward meaningful engagement with the world, the symptoms often resolve themselves naturally. This is not a matter of suppression or denial, but of proper orientation. The healthy person is not constantly monitoring themselves, but is engaged with life, absorbed in meaningful activity, connected to others. There is a paradox here that Viktor loved to point out. Happiness and fulfillment cannot be pursued directly. They are side effects of living a meaningful life. The person who makes happiness their goal, who constantly asks, "Am I happy?" will probably not be happy. But the person who pursues meaningful goals and relationships will often find happiness arising naturally as a byproduct. The same is true for self-actualization, another popular goal in humanistic psychology. Viktor argued that self-actualization is not achieved by focusing on oneself, but by forgetting oneself in the pursuit of meaning beyond oneself. The self actualizes precisely when it transcends itself. The third major technique in logotherapy involves what Viktor called attitudinal change, or the modification of attitudes. This is the most fundamental and far-reaching aspect of logotherapy because it addresses not specific symptoms, but the overall orientation of the person toward life. Many people suffer not because of diagnosable mental illness, but because they have adopted attitudes toward life that generate suffering. They may see themselves as victims, believing that their happiness depends entirely on external circumstances. They may see life as meaningless, a random series of events leading nowhere. They may see other people as obstacles or resources rather than as ends in themselves. Logotherapy challenges these attitudes and helps people adopt more life-affirming perspectives. But this is not a matter of simply thinking positive thoughts or engaging in self-deception. Viktor was deeply opposed to any form of cheap optimism that denied reality. The attitudinal change that logotherapy promotes is based on a clear-eyed recognition of life's difficulties, combined with a choice to find meaning nonetheless. One of the key concepts here is what Viktor called tragic optimism. This is the ability to maintain hope, to find meaning, and to affirm life even in the face of what he called the tragic triad: pain, guilt, and death. These three are unavoidable aspects of human existence. We will all experience pain. We will all be guilty of failures and shortcomings. We will all die. A psychology that cannot help people deal with these realities is inadequate. Tragic optimism is not a denial of these harsh facts, but a transformation of them. Pain can be transformed into achievement, the achievement of bearing suffering courageously and growing through it. Guilt can be transformed into an opportunity to change, to become a better person than we have been. Death can be transformed into an incentive to live more meaningfully, to take seriously the limited time we have. Viktor would say that the finiteness of life is precisely what makes it meaningful. If we lived forever, we could postpone everything indefinitely. But because our time is limited, because this moment will not come again, every choice we make carries weight and significance. Viktor often spoke of responsibility as a key element of mental health. The word responsibility comes from the ability to respond. We are responsible beings, which means we have the ability to respond to life's demands. Life is constantly asking us questions, presenting us with situations that call for a response. The neurotic person, Viktor said, acts as if life owes them something, as if the question is what they can get from life. The healthy person understands that life is asking something of them, and the question is what they can give to life. This shift from demanding to responding is transformative. When we approach life with the attitude that it should satisfy us, make us happy, meet our needs, we set ourselves up for disappointment and resentment. Life will inevitably fail to meet all our demands. But when we approach life with the attitude that we are here to respond to its demands, to fulfill the meanings it presents to us, then we become empowered. We shift from being passive victims of circumstances to being active agents, choosing how to respond. Viktor emphasized that meaning is always specific and concrete. There is no abstract meaning of life in general. There is only the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. The question is not, what is the meaning of life? But what is life asking of me right now? What is the meaning of this particular situation I find myself in? This meaning will be different for different people and different times. It is always unique, always personal, always situated. This means that logotherapy is not a one-size-fits-all approach. The therapist does not have a formula for meaning that applies to everyone. The therapist's role is to help each individual discover their own unique meaning, to become aware of the possibilities for meaning that exist in their particular life situation. This requires what Viktor called a Socratic dialogue, a process of questioning and exploration in which the patient comes to their own insights rather than having interpretations imposed on them. Viktor was influenced here by existential philosophy, particularly the work of Martin Heidegger and other phenomenologists, though he translated these philosophical ideas into practical therapeutic terms. From existential philosophy, Viktor took the idea that existence precedes essence, that human beings do not have a fixed nature, but create themselves through their choices. But where some existentialists saw this as leading to absurdity and despair, Viktor saw it as leading to freedom and responsibility. Yes, we create ourselves through our choices, and this is precisely why our choices matter, why we are responsible for becoming who we are. Viktor also drew on the resources of the spiritual traditions, though he insisted that logotherapy was not itself a religious therapy. Logotherapy, he said, operates on the secular dimension and is applicable to people of any religion or no religion. But he recognized that religious faith was for many people a powerful source of meaning, and he saw no reason why a logotherapist should not support a patient's religious faith if it was genuinely meaningful to them. He distinguished between religion as genuine faith and religion as neurotic defense mechanism, just as he distinguished between genuine meaning and pseudo-meanings. Pseudo-meanings are what people adopt when they cannot find genuine meaning. These might include hedonistic pursuits, the mindless pursuit of power or money, fanatical ideologies, or anything that fills the existential vacuum without actually addressing the deeper question of meaning. Viktor saw much of the social pathology of modern life, including addiction, violence, and totalitarianism, as rooted in the existential vacuum. When people cannot find meaning, they become susceptible to destructive pseudo-meanings. This brings us to one of the most significant aspects of Viktor's work, his analysis of the spiritual dimension of human existence. Viktor argued that human beings are not merely biological and psychological beings, but also spiritual beings. By spiritual, he did not necessarily mean religious, though the religious impulse is one manifestation of the spiritual dimension. He meant something more fundamental, the specifically human capacity for self-awareness, freedom, responsibility, and the search for meaning. Animals, Viktor pointed out, live according to instinct and conditioning. They respond to drives and stimuli. But human beings, uniquely, can step back from their drives and impulses, can observe themselves, can choose their response. This capacity for self-transcendence and self-detachment is what Viktor meant by the spiritual dimension. It is the dimension in which freedom exists, in which we are not merely determined by our biology or our past, but can choose our future. Viktor developed what he called dimensional ontology to explain the relationship between the biological, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of human existence. He used an analogy to explain it. Imagine a three-dimensional object, like a cylinder, being projected into two dimensions. From one angle, it might appear as a circle. From another angle, it might appear as a rectangle. Both projections are accurate as far as they go, but neither captures the full reality of the three-dimensional object. Similarly, a human being can be studied from a biological perspective, and we will discover important truths about physiology and genetics. A human being can be studied from a psychological perspective, and we will discover important truths about emotions and behaviors. But neither perspective alone captures the full reality of the human person, which includes also the spiritual dimension. This spiritual dimension is not something separate from the biological and psychological dimensions. It is integrated with them, just as the cylinder is one object, even though it can be projected in different ways. But the spiritual dimension is the uniquely human dimension, the dimension of freedom and meaning, and it cannot be reduced to biology or psychology. A purely reductionist approach that tries to explain human beings entirely in terms of neurons or drives misses what is most essential about being human. Viktor called this reductionism one of the great dangers of modern psychology. When we reduce human beings to nothing but mechanisms, when we deny the reality of freedom and meaning, we not only make a philosophical error, we do practical harm. We undermine people's sense of responsibility, we strip away their dignity, and we deprive them of the very resources they need for mental health. If a person is taught that they are nothing but the product of their genes and their conditioning, that they have no real freedom, that meaning is an illusion, then why should they even try to live responsibly or find purpose? This reductionist worldview creates the existential vacuum it claims to describe. Viktor was particularly critical of what he called nothing but ness, the tendency in some schools of psychology to explain human phenomena as nothing but something more basic. Love is nothing but sexual attraction. Conscience is nothing but the internalized voice of one's parents. Art is nothing but sublimated drive. Viktor argued that this nothing but ness misses the reality of emergence. The mani mater, fact that complex systems exhibit properties that cannot be predicted from or reduced to their components. Yes, love has a biological basis, but it is not nothing but biology. It is a spiritual reality, an act of recognizing the unique and irreplaceable value of another person. The spiritual dimension, for Viktor, is also the dimension of conscience. Conscience is not simply the internalized voice of society or parental authority. It is the organ through which we perceive meaning, through which we intuit what is specifically demanded of us in a given situation. Conscience can err, of course, which is why we need to reflect on and educate our conscience. But at its core, conscience is our responsiveness to the call of meaning. Viktor spoke of the conscience as operating on an unconscious level. Much of the spiritual life, he believed, takes place in what he called the unconscious spirituality, or the spiritual unconscious. This is not the Freudian unconscious of repressed drives, but a deeper dimension of the psyche where our fundamental relationship to meaning resides. It is from this spiritual unconscious that our deepest insights and intuitions arise, including artistic inspiration, ethical awareness, and the sense of ultimate meaning that religious people call God. Viktor did not argue for the existence of God in a philosophical or theological sense. He said that was beyond the scope of psychology. But he did argue that the human capacity for faith in ultimate meaning, the intuition that existence has significance beyond what we can comprehend, is a fundamental aspect of human spirituality. For some people, this takes a religious form. For others, it might be a humanistic faith in human dignity and potential. What matters, from a psychological perspective, is not which form it takes, but whether the person has some framework for ultimate meaning that allows them to make sense of their life. Viktor also spoke about what he called the super meaning, the idea that there is a meaning to the whole of existence, a a pattern or purpose that transcends our individual lives. This super meaning, he argued, is not fully comprehensible to the human mind. We cannot stand outside of existence to see its ultimate purpose, but we can have faith in it, and this faith can sustain us through times when the immediate meaning is unclear. Viktor compared this to an actor in a play who does not understand the full plot, but trusts that the playwright has a coherent story, even if the actor only knows their own lines. This faith in super meaning is not a flight from reality or an escape from responsibility. On the contrary, it grounds our responsibility. If we believe that there is meaning to existence, then our choices matter in a cosmic sense, not just a personal sense. We are contributing to something larger than ourselves, even if we cannot fully comprehend what that something is. Viktor's concept of meaning differs significantly from how meaning is often understood in popular culture. Meaning, for Viktor, is not something we create or invent. It is something we discover. It is not subjective, but objective, though our perception of it is personal. This might seem paradoxical, so let me unfold it carefully. Viktor believed that in any given situation, there are real possibilities for meaning, actual calls to action, genuine values to be realized. These are not arbitrary. They are rooted in the structure of reality itself. The person who helps someone in need is not simply creating meaning. They are responding to a real need, fulfilling a meaning that objectively exists. But the discovery of this meaning is personal and unique. Different people in the same situation might be called to respond in different ways based on their unique gifts and circumstances. The meaning is objective, but it is also uniquely tailored to the individual. This is why Viktor could say that meaning is both discovered and unique, both objective and personal. This has important implications for therapy. It means that the therapist cannot simply tell the patient what their life should mean. That would be imposing the therapist's values on the patient. But it also means that the therapist should not say that meaning is whatever the patient decides it is. That would be a kind of relativism that provides no real guidance. Instead, the therapist helps the patient to become more aware, more attuned to the meanings that are calling to them, the possibilities for meaningful action that exist in their particular life situation. Viktor gave many examples of how logotherapy works in practice. He spoke of patients who were suicidal until they discovered a meaning worth living for. He spoke of addicts who overcame their addiction when they found something more meaningful than the temporary escape that substances provided. He spoke of people suffering from psychosomatic illnesses that resolved when the underlying existential frustration was addressed. He spoke of people paralyzed by anxiety who found freedom when they learned to step outside their anxious self-focus. One particularly moving case involved an elderly general practitioner who came to Viktor in deep depression. The man's wife had died 2 years earlier, and he could not overcome his grief. Viktor asked him a simple question. What would have happened if you had died first and your wife had survived you? The man immediately replied that it would have been terrible for her, that she would have suffered greatly. Viktor then pointed out that by surviving his wife, the man has spared her that suffering. His grief, his continuing to live without her, was the price he was paying so that she would not have to pay it. In bearing this suffering, he was still loving her, still serving her. The man's grief did not disappear, but its meaning was transformed. He could bear it because it had become an act of love. This story illustrates the essence of logotherapy. Viktor did not try to minimize the man's suffering or talk him out of his grief. He accepted the grief as real and profound. But he helped the man find meaning in it, and that transformed it from unbearable to bearable, from senseless to significant. Viktor's approach to therapy was deeply respectful of the patient's autonomy and dignity. He did not see himself as an expert imposing solutions, but as a companion helping the patient on their journey of self-discovery. He used Socratic questioning to help patients come to their own insights rather than interpreting their unconscious for them as Freudian analysts did. He believed that every person, deep down, knows what their life is asking of them, and the therapist's role is to help bring that knowledge into consciousness. This respect for the patient's freedom and responsibility is fundamental to logotherapy. Viktor believed that one of the worst things a therapist could do is to reinforce a sense of determinism, to make the patient feel that they are just a victim of their past or their biology. Yes, we are influenced by our past and our biology, but we are not determined by them. We always retain the freedom to choose our response, and this freedom is the foundation of mental health. Viktor also emphasized what he called the defiant power of the human spirit. This is the capacity to maintain one's humanity, one's values, one's sense of meaning, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. He had seen this defiant power in the concentration camps, in people who refused to let the Nazis destroy their inner lives. But he also saw it in his patients, in people who faced illness, loss, disability, and still found ways to live meaningfully. This defiant power is not a denial of limitations, but a transcendence of them. It says, yes, I am limited, I am suffering, but I am more than my suffering. I am a human being with a freedom to choose my attitude and to find meaning. The influence of Viktor Frankl's work has been immense and continues to grow. Man's search for meaning has touched millions of lives, offering hope to people in all kinds of difficult circumstances. Logotherapy has been integrated into various therapeutic approaches and has influenced fields beyond psychology, including education, pastoral counseling, and organizational development. In the field of trauma therapy, Viktor's insights have proven particularly valuable. The understanding that healing from trauma involves finding meaning in the experience, not just processing emotions or changing cognitions, has informed many contemporary approaches. Trauma survivors who can find some meaning in what they went through, who can see how they have grown or how they can use their experience to help others, often heal more completely than those who see their trauma as purely senseless. Viktor's emphasis on resilience, on the human capacity to withstand and grow through adversity, has also influenced positive psychology and the study of post-traumatic growth. Researchers have found that many people who go through traumatic experiences report positive changes as well as suffering, deeper relationships, greater appreciation for life, new possibilities, spiritual growth, personal strength. This is not to say that trauma is good, but it confirms Viktor's observation that suffering can be transformative if we can find meaning in it. The spiritual dimension of Viktor's work has resonated particularly strongly in recent decades, as people have become increasingly interested in questions of meaning and purpose. In a secular age that has largely abandoned traditional religious frameworks but has not found adequate replacements, the existential vacuum that Viktor identified has become more acute. His insistence that spirituality is a fundamental human dimension, not reducible to biology or psychology, and that the search for meaning is a legitimate and necessary pursuit, has provided a framework for many people seeking something deeper than material success, or pleasure. Viktor's work has also influenced the hospice and palliative care movements. His insights about finding meaning in the face of death, about the importance of helping dying people feel that their life has been meaningful and that they can still find ways to give and receive love even as death approaches, these insights have shaped how end-of-life care is understood and practiced. The questions that hospice workers are trained to explore with patients, questions about legacy, relationships, unfinished business, spiritual concerns, these reflect Viktor's understanding that meaning is possible even in the final hours of life. In the corporate world, there has been a growing recognition that meaning and purpose matter for employee satisfaction and organizational health. People want to feel that their work contributes to something beyond just profit, that it serves some meaningful purpose. Organizations that can articulate a clear sense of mission and help employees see how their individual work contributes to that mission tend to have more engaged and fulfilled workers. This is a direct application of Viktor's insight that meaning is found in contributing to something beyond oneself. Viktor's techniques, particularly paradoxical intention and dereflection, have been incorporated into various therapeutic approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, uses variations of paradoxical intention in treating anxiety disorders. Acceptance and commitment therapy emphasizes values-based living and self-transcendence in ways that echo logotherapy. Mindfulness-based approaches use a form of dereflection, teaching people to observe their thoughts without identifying with them, to step back from the anxious self-focus that creates suffering. Yet for all its influence, logotherapy remains somewhat distinct from mainstream psychology. It is less about symptom reduction and more about existential transformation. It is less about adjustment to social norms and more about authentic living. It is less about happiness in the conventional sense and more about meaning, which may sometimes require sacrificing comfort for the sake of values. This has made logotherapy particularly appealing to people who feel that conventional therapy, with its emphasis on adaptation and coping, misses something essential about the human spirit. Critics of Viktor's work have sometimes argued that it places too much emphasis on individual meaning-making, and not enough on social and political action to change unjust structures. If people can find meaning even in concentration camps, the critique goes, doesn't that risk accepting injustice rather than fighting against it? Viktor would have rejected this criticism vehemently. He was not advocating for passive acceptance of evil. He was describing the inner freedom that remains even when outer freedom is taken away. And he would have said that one of the most important ways to find meaning is precisely through the struggle for justice, through working to alleviate suffering wherever possible. The attitudinal change he advocated was for unavoidable suffering, not for suffering that could be prevented or alleviated through action. Another criticism has been that Viktor's emphasis on meaning can seem abstract or intellectual, less immediately practical than approaches that focus on specific behavioral changes or emotional regulation. This criticism misses the depths of Viktor's approach. For Viktor, the search for meaning is not abstract at all. It is the most concrete thing there is. It is about the specific choices we make in each moment, the specific relationships we form, the specific projects we undertake. It is about how we respond to the particular circumstances of our lives, not about philosophical speculation. Some psychologists have also questioned whether the will to meaning is truly a universal human motivation, or whether Viktor was generalizing from his own experience and values. Cross-cultural research on meaning and purpose suggests that while the forms that meaning takes vary widely across cultures, the importance of having some sense of meaning or purpose appears to be universal. Every culture has ways of helping individuals find their place in a larger story, whether religious, familial, or communal. The existential vacuum that Viktor described seems to be a particularly modern and Western phenomenon, arising when traditional frameworks of meaning break down. But this actually supports Viktor's thesis. When meaning-making structures collapse, people suffer psychologically, which suggests that the need for meaning is fundamental. Viktor himself was humble about the scope of logotherapy. He did not claim it was the answer to all psychological problems. He saw it as one approach among many, particularly suited to existential and spiritual concerns, but not necessarily the best approach for all conditions. He had respect for other therapeutic schools, and saw them as potentially complementary rather than competitive. What he objected to was not Freudian or Adlerian psychology per se, but the reductionism and determinism that he saw in some versions of them. In his later years, Viktor reflected on the evolution of his thought and on the reception of his work. He was gratified that his ideas had spread so widely, but concerned that they sometimes were simplified or misunderstood. He emphasized repeatedly that logotherapy was not a panacea, not a simple formula, but a framework for helping people engage with the existential dimension of their lives. He also warned against what he called hyper-reflection on meaning, the danger of becoming so obsessed with finding meaning that one loses the spontaneity and engagement with life that actually generates meaning. Meaning, he said, must be found, not sought. It arises naturally when we are engaged with life, not when we are standing apart analyzing whether our life is meaningful enough. Viktor also reflected on the relationship between his own suffering and his work. He was sometimes asked whether he was glad, in retrospect, that he had gone through the concentration camps because of what he learned there. He always rejected this suggestion with something approaching anger. No, he would say, he was not glad it happened. It should never have happened. The Holocaust was an absolute evil, and nothing can justify or redeem it. But having gone through it, he was determined to extract meaning from it, to use what he learned to help others. That was the only way to prevent it from being entirely meaningless. The meaning was not in the suffering itself, but in the response to the suffering. This distinction is crucial for understanding Viktor's entire philosophy. He was not saying that suffering is good, or that we should be grateful for terrible things. He was saying that when we cannot avoid suffering, we still have the power to give it meaning by how we respond to it. This is a tragic optimism, not a naive one. It acknowledges the tragedy while refusing to surrender to despair. And now, let us step back from the particulars of Viktor's life and work and consider them in a broader context, as part of the great ongoing human conversation about who we are and what our lives mean. Let us reflect on how his insights illuminate not just individual psychology, but the collective human condition, the great questions of philosophy, the nature of consciousness, the mystery of meaning itself. Viktor Frankl stands in a long tradition of thinkers who have grappled with the question of meaning. From the ancient Stoics like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, who taught that we cannot control what happens to us, but can control our response, to the existentialists like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, who proclaimed that God is dead and we must create our own values, to the phenomenologists like Heidegger, who analyzed the structure of human existence. Viktor drew from this rich tradition and added something uniquely his own, the testimony of extreme suffering transformed into life-affirming wisdom. What makes Viktor's contribution distinctive is that it is not merely philosophical speculation, but lived experience. He did not theorize about suffering from the comfort of an academic office. He endured suffering that would have destroyed most people, and he emerged with his faith in human dignity and meaning intact. This gives his work a credibility and a power that purely theoretical approaches cannot match. When Viktor says that meaning can be found in any circumstance, we know he is not speaking abstractly. He is reporting from the depths. There is something profoundly hopeful in Viktor's vision of human nature. In an age dominated by reductionist and deterministic thinking, where we are told we are nothing but our genes, nothing but our brain chemistry, nothing but the product of our conditioning, Viktor insists on the irreducible reality of human freedom and spirituality. We are not just mechanisms responding to stimuli. We are beings capable of stepping back from our conditioning, of observing ourselves, of choosing our response, of creating meaning. This is not a religious claim, though it is compatible with religious faith. It is a phenomenological observation about what it means to be human. Viktor's emphasis on self-transcendence as the key to mental health is particularly relevant in our current age of narcissism and self-obsession. Contemporary culture tells us constantly to focus on ourselves, to pursue self-actualization, to seek happiness, to maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain. But as Viktor pointed out, this very self-focus is often the problem. The more we focus on being happy, the less happy we become. The more we focus on actualizing ourselves, the more we feel we are failing. Happiness and self-actualization cannot be pursued directly. They come as byproducts of self-transcendence, of forgetting ourselves in the pursuit of meanings beyond ourselves. This insight connects to one of the deepest paradoxes of human existence. We find ourselves by losing ourselves. We become who we truly are, not through introspection and self-focus, but through engagement with the world, through love, through work, through commitment to values that transcend our individual existence. The self is not a thing to be discovered within, like a pearl hidden in a shell. The self is created through our relationships and commitments, through how we respond to what life asks of us. Viktor's work also illuminates the relationship between freedom and meaning. In much of contemporary discourse, freedom is understood negatively, as freedom from constraints. We are free to the extent that we can do what we want, that no one is telling us what to do. But this negative freedom, by itself, is empty. It leaves us with the question, free to do what? Free for what purpose? This is where meaning comes in. Meaning provides positive freedom, freedom for something. When we discover what our life is asking of us, when we commit ourselves to meaningful goals and relationships, we experience a deeper freedom than mere absence of constraint. We experience the freedom of knowing what we are about, of having direction and purpose. This is why Viktor said that freedom without responsibility becomes license, becomes destructive. Freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. We are free to choose, but we are also responsible for our choices. This responsibility is not a burden, but the foundation of dignity. To be responsible means that our choices matter, that we are not just drifting through life, but actively shaping it. Viktor often said that freedom is only half the truth. The other half is responsibleness, and together they constitute the fullness of human existence. The question of meaning also touches on one of the most fundamental issues in philosophy: the relationship between facts and values, between is and ought. Modern science tells us what is, describes the world as it exists, but it cannot tell us what ought to be, cannot prescribe values or purposes. This has led some thinkers to conclude that values and purposes are purely subjective, that there is no objective basis for meaning. Viktor rejected this conclusion. He believed that meaning, while discovered subjectively, points to something objective. When we perceive that a certain action is called for, that we ought to help this person or complete this work, we are not simply inventing a value. We are responding to a real call, perceiving a real demand that the situation places on us. This view connects Viktor to the tradition of ethical realism, the view that there are objective moral truths independent of our opinions about them. But Viktor's approach is distinctive in that he grounds this ethical realism not in abstract principles or divine commands, but in the concrete demands of specific situations. Meaning, for Viktor, is always situational, always unique to the particular circumstances. There is no universal formula for meaning. There is only the specific call that this moment, this situation, this person's life is presenting. This situational approach to meaning makes Viktor's philosophy deeply existential, while avoiding the nihilism that sometimes characterizes existentialism. Yes, we create ourselves through our choices, but we are not creating meaning out of nothing. We are discovering meanings that are already there, latent in the situations we encounter. The meanings are objective, but they are also unique and personal. This is a subtle and sophisticated position that transcends the usual dichotomy between objectivism and subjectivism. Viktor's concept of the spiritual dimension also opens up important questions about consciousness and the nature of the self. What is this spiritual dimension that he speaks of? It is not something separate from the body or the psyche. It is integrated with them, but it is also irreducible to them. It is the dimension of freedom, of self-awareness, of meaning perception. It is what makes us uniquely human. Modern neuroscience has made tremendous progress in understanding the biological basis of consciousness, in mapping which brain regions are involved in various mental functions. But the more we learn about the brain, the deeper the mystery of consciousness becomes. How does subjective experience, the felt sense of what it's like to be me, arise from neural activity? How does meaning emerge from matter? These are the hard problems of consciousness that science has not yet solved and may never fully solve. Viktor's dimensional ontology suggests that these questions may be unanswerable from within a purely reductionist framework. If consciousness and meaning belong to a different dimension than neural activity, then we should not expect to fully explain them in neural terms. This is not to say that the brain is irrelevant to consciousness. Of course it is relevant. Damage to the brain affects consciousness, but the relationship may be more like that between a radio and the music it plays. The radio is necessary for the music to be heard, but the music is not produced by the radio. It is transmitted through the radio. Similarly, the brain may be necessary for consciousness, but not sufficient to explain it. This is speculative, and Viktor himself did not push too far into these metaphysical waters. His concern was always practical. How can we help people live more meaningful lives? But his work does suggest that there are aspects of human existence that transcend purely materialist explanations, and that a complete psychology must take these aspects seriously. Viktor's emphasis on the tragic triad, pain, guilt, and death, also places him in a long philosophical and spiritual tradition that takes seriously the inevitability of suffering. Many religious and philosophical traditions have tried to make sense of suffering, to explain why a supposedly good God or benevolent universe would allow pain and death. Theodicies, justifications of divine justice in the face of evil, have been central to theology. But Viktor was not primarily concerned with theodicy. He was concerned with psychology, with how we actually respond to suffering when we encounter it. His answer, as we have seen, is that suffering becomes bearable when we can find meaning in it. But this raises a deeper question. Is this meaning real? Or is it a comforting illusion, a psychological defense mechanism that helps us avoid despair? Is Viktor offering wisdom or just sophisticated coping? This question cuts to the heart of many debates about religion and spirituality. Are these genuine insights into the nature of reality, or are they comforting fictions that help us deal with a harsh and meaningless universe? Viktor would have said that the question itself is wrong, that it assumes a sharp dichotomy between objective reality and subjective meaning that does not actually exist. Meaning is not less real just because it involves subjective perception. When we perceive that a situation calls for a certain response, when we recognize that helping this person is the right thing to do, we are perceiving something real about the situation, even if that perception involves our subjective values and commitments. Moreover, Viktor would have pointed out that the proof is in the results. The person who finds meaning in their suffering can endure and grow. The person who sees it as absolutely meaningless tends toward despair and disintegration. From a pragmatic perspective, then, meaning works. It enables human flourishing in ways that nihilism does not. And if something works, if it helps us live well, then in a certain sense it is true, or at least as close to truth as we can get. This pragmatic approach to meaning connects Viktor to the American pragmatist philosophers like William James, who argued that the truth of a belief should be judged by its practical consequences. If believing in meaning helps us live better lives, then meaning is true in the sense that matters most. This does not mean that anything goes, that we can just make up any meaning we want. False meanings, pseudo-meanings, do not work in the long run. They do not sustain us through difficulty. Only genuine meanings, meanings that resonate with the actual demands of our situation and our deepest values, have the power to truly sustain us. Viktor's work also speaks to the relationship between individual meaning and collective meaning, between personal fulfillment and social responsibility. In some interpretations of existentialism and humanistic psychology, the emphasis on individual self-actualization can seem narcissistic, focused entirely on personal growth, with little attention to social justice or collective well-being. But Viktor's approach avoids this trap because meaning, for him, is always found in self-transcendence, in going beyond oneself toward other people and larger causes. The person who finds meaning is not turning inward, but turning outward. They are engaging with the world, serving others, contributing to something beyond themselves. This means that the pursuit of meaning naturally leads to ethical behavior and social engagement, not because we are trying to be good, but because being good, serving others, is where meaning is found. Ethics is not a constraint on the pursuit of meaning, but an expression of it. This has implications for how we think about social change and justice. A society in which people find meaning is likely to be a more just and humane society, because people who are living meaningfully are engaged, compassionate, and responsible. Conversely, a society characterized by the existential vacuum is likely to be more violent, addictive, and authoritarian, because people who cannot find meaning become desperate and destructive. Viktor witnessed this in the rise of Nazism, the existential vacuum of post-World War I Europe. The loss of traditional structures of meaning combined with economic desperation created conditions in which people became susceptible to the false meaning offered by totalitarian ideology. This suggests that the search for meaning is not just a private, individual matter, but has profound social and political implications. A culture that supports meaning-making, that provides opportunities for people to contribute meaningfully, that honors the spiritual dimension of human existence, is a healthier culture than one that reduces people to consumers and producers, that measures success solely in material terms, that denies the reality of anything beyond the physical and economic. In this sense, Viktor's work is quietly radical. It challenges the dominant, materialistic, and reductionist worldview of modern industrial society. It says that human beings need more than material comfort and stimulation. They need meaning, purpose, spiritual engagement. And if a society cannot provide conditions that support the search for meaning, it will produce alienated, unhappy people, no matter how much material wealth it generates. Viktor's influence on modern spirituality is part of a broader movement, sometimes called the New Existentialism or secular spirituality. This movement acknowledges that many people no longer find traditional religious frameworks compelling, but still hunger for transcendence, meaning, and spiritual depth. Viktor's logotherapy offers a framework for this search that does not require adherence to any particular religious tradition, but also does not reduce spirituality to mere psychology. It takes seriously the spiritual dimension as a real and irreducible aspect of human existence. This has resonated particularly strongly in recent decades as more people identify as spiritual but not religious. They are seeking meaning, seeking connection to something larger than themselves, seeking practices and frameworks that support their spiritual life, but they are not comfortable with traditional religious institutions or dogmas. Viktor's approach, which is grounded in empirical observation and therapeutic practice, but open to transcendence and meaning, provides a middle way. The techniques of logotherapy can also be seen as spiritual practices in their own right. Paradoxical intention teaches us not to take ourselves too seriously, to step back from our anxious self-focus with humor and lightness. This is similar to practices in various spiritual traditions that use humor and playfulness to break through ego identification. De-reflection teaches us to turn our attention away from ourselves toward others and toward meaningful engagement with the world. This is the essence of many contemplative practices that seek to transcend the small self. Attitudinal change, the cultivation of tragic optimism, is a form of spiritual transformation, a reorientation of the whole person toward meaning and value. In this light, logotherapy can be seen not just as a form of psychotherapy, but as a form of spiritual direction, a way of helping people on their journey toward living more authentic, meaningful, and spiritually engaged lives. Viktor himself would probably have resisted this characterization, wanting to maintain the scientific and secular credentials of logotherapy. But there is no doubt that his work touches on the deepest spiritual questions and offers resources for addressing them. Let us consider also the relationship between Viktor's work and the great wisdom traditions of East and West. Viktor was primarily educated in the Western philosophical and psychological traditions, but there are striking parallels between his insights and teachings from Buddhism, Taoism, Stoicism, and other wisdom traditions. The Buddha's teaching that suffering arises from attachment and that liberation comes through recognizing the impermanence of all things has similarities to Viktor's emphasis on self-transcendence. Both teach that clinging to pleasure and avoiding pain is a recipe for suffering, and that true peace comes from letting go of this clinging, from accepting what is and finding meaning in it. The Buddhist practice of mindfulness, of observing one's thoughts and feelings without identifying with them, is very similar to the self-detachment that Viktor spoke of. The Taoist teaching of Wu Wei, of going with the flow rather than constantly struggling against reality, also echoes Viktor's emphasis on accepting unavoidable suffering and finding meaning in it rather than fighting against what cannot be changed. The Taoist sage is someone who has learned to respond appropriately to each situation, to act in harmony with the Tao, the way things are. Viktor's concept of responding to the specific demands of each situation is similar. The Stoic philosophers, particularly Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, emphasized that we cannot control external events, but can control our judgment about them. And that virtue consists in responding to events with wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. This is very close to Viktor's emphasis on freedom to choose one's attitude and on the attitudinal change that logotherapy promotes. The Stoics also emphasized that we are part of a larger cosmic order and that our duty is to fulfill our role in that order, which is similar to Viktor's concept of responding to life's demands. These parallels suggest that Viktor was tapping into something universal, something that wise people across different cultures and eras have recognized. The specific formulations may differ. The cultural contexts may be vastly different, but the core insight is similar, that human fulfillment comes not from seeking pleasure or power, but from living in accordance with meaning, from accepting what cannot be changed and changing what can be changed, from transcending the small ego self in service of something larger. Yet Viktor's formulation also has something unique to contribute to this conversation across traditions. His experience of the concentration camps, his testing of these insights in the most extreme conditions imaginable, gives his testimony a particular power. He is not speculating about how one might find meaning in suffering. He is reporting from the depths of hell that yes, even there, meaning was possible, and that this meaning made the difference between survival and death, between maintaining one's humanity and losing it. This testimony is particularly important for the modern world because we live in an age that has witnessed horrors on an unprecedented scale. The Holocaust, but also the many other genocides and atrocities of the 20th and 21st centuries have raised profound questions about meaning and human nature. How can we maintain faith in human dignity after Auschwitz? How can we believe in progress after the world wars, after the atomic bomb, after terrorism and mass shootings? Viktor's answer is not a philosophical argument, but a witness. He is saying, I was there in the worst place humans have created, and even there, I saw human dignity, I saw meaning, I saw the defined power of the human spirit. This testimony does not erase the horror or justify it in any way. Viktor never tried to offer a theodicy for the Holocaust. He simply said that even in the midst of absolute evil, human beings retain the capacity to choose their response, to maintain their inner freedom, to find meaning, and this capacity is the foundation of hope. If meaning was possible even there, then it is possible anywhere. If the human spirit could assert itself even in that darkness, then we can trust in its resilience no matter what we face. Viktor's work also illuminates the relationship between trauma and meaning. We now recognize that trauma is not just about what happens to us, but about how we integrate what happens to us into our life. Story. Two people can go through the same traumatic event and have very different outcomes. One may be shattered by it, developing PTSD, depression, addiction. The other may be transformed by it, developing greater strength, deeper compassion, clearer purpose. The difference is not in the event itself, but in how the person makes sense of it, what meaning they find in it. This does not mean that we should blame trauma survivors who struggle. Trauma is real, and its effects can be devastating. But it does mean that part of healing from trauma involves finding a way to integrate it into a meaningful life narrative. This might mean seeing how one has grown through it, or how one can use the experience to help others, or simply how one has survived it and maintained one's dignity. The meaning transforms the trauma from something purely destructive into something that, while terrible, has become part of a larger story of resilience and growth. Viktor's concept of the existential vacuum also provides a framework for understanding many of the social and psychological problems of contemporary life. We live in societies of unprecedented material prosperity, at least in the developed world. Yet rates of depression, anxiety, addiction, and suicide are high and rising. Traditional explanations in terms of biochemical imbalances or psychological trauma do not fully account for this. What Viktor would say is that many people are suffering from the existential vacuum, from a lack of meaning and purpose. Modern life, for all its comforts, often fails to provide the conditions that support meaning-making. Work is often experienced as meaningless, a way to make money rather than a calling or vocation. Communities are fragmented, leaving people isolated. Traditional sources of meaning like religion and extended family have weakened. Consumer culture tells us constantly that happiness comes from acquiring things, from satisfying desires, but this proves hollow. Social media creates an illusion of connection while actually deepening isolation. The result is that many people, especially young people, feel lost, uncertain about what their lives are for. Viktor's work suggests that addressing these problems requires more than just better therapy or medication, though those can help. It requires cultural change, a reorientation toward meaning and value. It requires creating conditions in which people can find meaningful work, build genuine communities, develop their spiritual lives, and contribute to something beyond themselves. This is not just a psychological issue, but a political and cultural one. The question of meaning also connects to debates about artificial intelligence and the future of humanity. As machines become more capable, as artificial intelligence begins to match and exceed human capabilities in more and more domains, questions arise about what makes humans special, what role humans will play in a world increasingly shaped by technology. Viktor's work suggests an answer. What makes us uniquely human is not our intelligence or our productivity, but our capacity for meaning, our spiritual dimension, our freedom to choose our response to any situation. No matter how sophisticated artificial intelligence becomes, it will not have this spiritual dimension. It will not search for meaning because it does not exist in the way that humans exist. It does not face death does not experience the existential anxiety of freedom, does not love or hope or despair. These uniquely human experiences are bound up with our finitude, our vulnerability, our embodiment, our mortality, and these are the experiences from which meaning arises. This suggests that in a world increasingly dominated by technology, the things that make us human, the spiritual and meaning-making capacities that Viktor identified, will become more rather than less important. We will need to cultivate these capacities deliberately to ensure that human life remains oriented toward meaning and value, rather than becoming merely an adjunct to technological systems. Viktor's vision of human nature is ultimately one of profound dignity and hope. He saw in human beings a capacity for self-transcendence, for freedom, for finding meaning even in the darkest circumstances. This is not a naive or sentimental view. It is grounded in clear-eyed observation of human behavior at its worst and its best. Viktor saw the depths of human cruelty in the concentration camps. He also saw the heights of human nobility there. And what he concluded was that we always have a choice. The circumstances do not determine our response, that we are responsible for becoming who we are. This vision stands in stark contrast to various forms of determinism and nihilism that characterize much modern thought. Whether it is genetic determinism that sees us as slaves to our DNA, or psychological determinism that sees us as prisoners of our childhood, or sociological determinism that sees us as products of our social circumstances, or nihilism that sees life as ultimately meaningless, Viktor's work offers an alternative. Yes, we are influenced by all these factors, but we are not determined by them. We retain the freedom to choose our response, and in that freedom lies our dignity and our hope. This is perhaps Viktor's greatest gift to us, the testimony that human freedom and human dignity are not illusions, not comforting fictions, but realities that assert themselves even in the most extreme circumstances. The concentration camp, designed to destroy human dignity, could not ultimately succeed because the human spirit has a defiant power that transcends circumstances. The prisoners who maintain their humanity, who share their bread, who comforted others, who refused to let the Nazis rob them of their inner freedom, these prisoners prove that human dignity is indestructible. And if this is true in the concentration camp, then it is true everywhere. No matter what we face, no matter how difficult our circumstances, we retain this fundamental freedom, this capacity for self-transcendence, this ability to find meaning. This is not a guarantee of happiness or comfort. Viktor never promised that. He promised something more profound, that our lives can have meaning, that we can live with dignity, that we can maintain our humanity no matter what happens to us. As we drift towards sleep, let this be the thought we carry with us, that we are meaning-seeking beings, that this search for meaning is what makes us human, that even in suffering we can find purpose, and that the freedom to choose our response to any situation is the ultimate human freedom, one that can never be taken from us unless we surrender it. Viktor Frankl journeyed to the depths and returned with this message of tragic optimism, this faith in the human spirit, this wisdom that suffering can be transformative if we can find meaning in it. His life was a testament to his teaching. From the Vienna of his youth to the hell of the concentration camps to his long years of healing and teaching, Viktor lived what he taught. He found meaning in his suffering. He maintained his humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. and he dedicated his life to helping others discover their own capacity for meaning and freedom. The story of Viktor Frankl is ultimately a story about the human capacity for resilience, for growth, for self-transcendence. It is a story that says that no matter how dark the night, meaning can be found, and that this meaning is not a luxury or an abstraction, but the most essential thing, the thing that makes life worth living, the thing that keeps us human. In a world that often seems meaningless, that confronts us with suffering and injustice and loss, Victor's message is more relevant than ever. We need to hear that meaning is possible, that our lives matter, that our choices have significance, that we are not just random atoms, bouncing around in a void, but beings with purpose and dignity, capable of creating meaning and beauty and love, even in the midst of darkness. Victor once wrote that what matters is not what we expect from life, but what life expects from us. Life is asking us questions every day, presenting us with situations that call for a response. The question is not whether we will be happy or comfortable or successful. The question is whether we will respond to life's demands with integrity, whether we will find and fulfill the meanings that our unique circumstances call us toward, whether we will maintain our humanity and our dignity, no matter what happens. This is the wisdom of Viktor Frankl, a wisdom earned through suffering, tested in the crucible of the concentration camps, and offered to the world as a gift. It is wisdom that does not make suffering disappear, but transforms it, that does not promise happiness, but offers something deeper, that does not remove our responsibility, but empowers it. As you drift off to sleep, let these thoughts settle into your consciousness, like snow falling softly on the ground. Let the image of Viktor Frankl accompany you into your dreams. A small man with fierce eyes and a profound message. A survivor who refused to let survival be enough, who insisted that we are called to something more, to meaning, to purpose, to self-transcendence. Consider your own life in light of his teachings. What is life asking of you right now? What meanings are calling to you that you have not yet responded to? Where can you practice self-transcendence, forgetting yourself in the service of something beyond yourself? How can you find meaning not just in your successes and pleasures, but also in your challenges and sufferings? These are not questions to be answered quickly or easily. They are the questions of a lifetime, questions we must continually return to as our circumstances change and as we ourselves change. But they are the essential questions, the questions that Victor's life and work point us toward, the questions that lead us toward a more meaningful existence. Viktor Frankl's legacy is not just a set of therapeutic techniques or psychological theories. It is a vision of human possibility, a testimony to the human spirit, a reminder that we are more than our circumstances, that we retain the freedom to choose our response, that meaning can be found even in suffering, and that this search for meaning is what gives life its value and its beauty. Sleep now with these thoughts. Rest in the knowledge that your life has meaning, that you are part of a larger story, that your choices matter, that even in difficulty you have the power to choose your response, and that in that power lies your freedom and your dignity. Let Victor's tragic optimism infuse your dreams. His faith in the human spirit give you peace. His testimony from the depths assure you that meaning is always possible. The way forward is not always clear. Suffering will come, as it comes to all human lives. Loss and disappointment and failure will visit us all. But we have within us the capacity that Victor identified and lived, the capacity to find meaning nevertheless, to say yes to life, in spite of everything, to choose our attitude, to transcend our circumstances, to remain human no matter what. This is the gift of Viktor Frankl to the world, not a denial of suffering, but a transformation of it, not a promise that life will be easy, but a testament that it can be meaningful, not an escape from reality, but a deeper engagement with it, not a passive acceptance, but an active choice to find meaning and maintain dignity. As the night deepens and consciousness fades, carry this with you. You are a meaning-seeking being. You have the freedom to choose your response to whatever life brings. Your life matters and has purpose, and the search for that meaning and purpose is the most human thing you can do. Viktor Frankl walked through hell and emerged with this message intact. Trust in it. Rest in it. Let it guide you. The world whispers its questions to you in the dark. What will you answer? What meaning will you find? What will you say yes to, even in the midst of suffering? Viktor's life teaches us that these questions can be answered, that meaning can be found, that the human spirit is resilient beyond measure. Sleep now, wanderer. Tomorrow will bring its own demands, its own opportunities for meaning. But tonight, rest in the knowledge that you have within you everything you need to meet those demands with dignity and purpose. Rest in the wisdom of Viktor Frankl, this seeker of meaning who mapped the landscape of the human spirit and showed us that meaning is always possible, always available, always worth searching for. The story of Viktor Frankl is ultimately a love letter to humanity, a testimony to our capacity for transcendence, a reminder that we are spiritual beings as well as physical and psychological ones, and that this spiritual dimension is where our deepest humanity resides. In finding meaning, we find ourselves. In transcending ourselves, we become most fully who we are. In saying yes to life despite everything, we affirm the ultimate value and dignity of human existence. May His wisdom accompany you through the night. May His courage inspire you in difficulty. May His faith and meaning sustain you when things seem meaningless. And may His testimony remind you always that you are more than your circumstances, that you have the freedom to choose, and that in that freedom lies the foundation of all human dignity and all human hope. Rest now in this knowledge. Sleep deeply with this truth. And when you wake, carry forward the legacy of Viktor Frankl, the legacy of meaning-seeking, of self-transcendence, of tragic optimism, of faith in the defiant power of the human spirit. This is His gift to us. This is the wisdom He brought back from the depths. This is the light He carried through the darkness and offers still to all who will receive it. Good night, seeker of meaning. Good night, wanderer of the inner world. Good night, fellow traveler on this human journey. May Viktor's wisdom guide your dreams and his courage strengthen your waking life. May you find the meanings that your life calls you toward. May you maintain your dignity in all circumstances. May you discover the freedom that is always yours, the freedom to choose your response, to say yes to life, to become who you truly are. The night is deep now, and consciousness fades into the realm of dreams. But the truths we have explored together remain, settling into your mind like seeds that will grow in their own time. Viktor Frankl's life and work will continue to unfold in your understanding, revealing new layers of meaning as you bring his wisdom into conversation with your own experience. For this is the nature of wisdom. It is not simply information to be learned, but a living truth to be engaged with, to be tested against experience, to be integrated into one's own life. Viktor did not offer us a formula or a dogma, but a framework for understanding our own search for meaning, a map of the territory we all must traverse, a companion for the journey that each of us must make in our own unique way. His teachings remind us that we are not alone in our struggles, that others have faced darkness and emerged with their humanity intact, that the search for meaning is universal, even though the meanings we find are unique, that suffering is part of life but need not be the end of meaning, and that we have more power than we know to shape our experience through our attitudes and choices. These truths are simple but profound, easy to state but difficult to live, obvious in retrospect but hidden in the midst of struggle. Viktor's gift was to articulate them clearly, to ground them in experience both clinical and personal, to show us through his own life that they are not just theoretical but practical, not just philosophical but psychological, not just words but a way of living. As you sleep, may these truths work in you at levels deeper than conscious thought. May they reshape your understanding of who you are and what your life is for. May they give you courage in difficulty, hope in despair, meaning in suffering. May they remind you of your own defiant power, your own spiritual dimension, your own capacity for self-transcendence. The legacy of Viktor Frankl continues through everyone who reads his work and allows it to transform their understanding of human possibility. You are now part of that legacy, carrying forward the wisdom he discovered in the depths and the hope he maintained in the darkness. Your own search for meaning, your own choices to maintain dignity in difficulty, your own acts of self-transcendence, these continue the work that Viktor began. And so the story goes on, as it must, as it always has, the eternal human story of seeking meaning, of choosing freedom, of maintaining dignity, of saying yes to life despite all the reasons to say no. Viktor Frankl is your companion on this journey, as he has been companion to millions before you. Listen to his testimony. Trust in his wisdom. Follow the path he mapped, not slavishly, but creatively, making it your own, discovering your own unique meanings along the way. The night is silent now, and sleep beckons. Let go of these thoughts, allow them to sink beneath consciousness, to do their work in the depths. Tomorrow will bring new situations, new calls to meaning, new opportunities to practice the wisdom of Viktor Frankl. But tonight, simply rest, simply be, simply allow yourself to be held by the great mystery of existence that Viktor spent his life exploring and honoring. You are a being of infinite worth and dignity. Your life matters and has meaning. You have the freedom to choose your response to whatever comes. And in that freedom lies everything that makes you human, everything that makes life worth living, everything that cannot be taken from you unless you choose to surrender it. Viktor Frankl's life was a testimony to these truths. His work was an elaboration of them. His legacy is their ongoing realization in the lives of all who hear his message and allow it to transform them. You are part of that legacy now, carried forward with courage and grace. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you are more than you think you are, that your life means more than you know, that you have within you resources of strength and resilience that you have not yet had to call upon, and that when you do need them, they will be there, as they were there for Viktor in his darkest hour. Good night, dear traveler. Good night, seeker of meaning. Good night, bearer of the human spirit's defiant power. May your sleep be deep, and your dreams be filled with the wisdom of Viktor Frankl, this physician of the soul who descended into hell and returned with the message that meaning is always possible and that the human spirit cannot ultimately be defeated. Rest now, all is well. You are held by something larger than yourself. Your search for meaning is itself meaningful. Your life matters. Sleep deeply in this truth.